Good afternoon. Today is Friday, April 15th, 2016. We are here for an oral history interview with Iris Knell, former coordinator of the Robinson Professor Program. My name is Emily Curley, and Bob Fay is assisting. We are conducting this interview on behalf of the George Mason University Oral History Program. Our interview is taking place in the seminar room in the Special Collections Research Center at Fenwick Library. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
So to begin, can you tell us a bit about your background in education?
I went to University of Illinois. I have a bachelor's degree in English education and then a master's just in English literature. So I have, upon realizing I didn't really enjoy children, I have only substituted. Once I was a school librarian, briefly I minored in library for education purposes. So
what year did you arrive at George Mason University, and how did you hear about the Robinson program?
I think I arrived at George Mason maybe in '85, and I worked first in the business school and then briefly in the library. And I was in the market for a position, and the Robinson position came open. I knew very little about, in fact, I knew nothing whatsoever about the Robinson professors. Well, the things I knew were this. As I walked from, the library past the East Building, pieces of the building were shooting down a trough. So I knew something was happening there. That turns out they were building the Robinson Suite. And I knew of one Robinson professor, Thelma Levine, as she held her classes in the conference room. I don't know if it's still here in the library. It was the nicest room in the library. And she held some sort of a seminar there with coffee and cookies. Who provided the coffee and cookies? I don't know, but it was quite close to our office. And so that's it. I went, okay, that's absolutely all I knew about the program.
Okay. So what were your original responsibilities, and how was it to work with such a new program at the university?
Well, to begin with, I was very carefully instructed by Steve Diner, who was, at that point, we didn't have a provost. We had a vice president of academic affairs or something like that, David King. And the actual administration of the program was under David King's office. So he tasked Steve Diner with finding the coordinator of the program. So Steve interviewed however many people he interviewed and told me very specifically exactly what was to be done, that these were very special people. However, they were not to be treated as though they were prima donnas. They were to be professors as well and fit in. And the fact that, I'm sure he must have told me this, the fact that they were not being housed in their departments was a big deal, to the departments particularly. So they needed to be active in their departments and involved with them, although they were going to be endowed chairs housed together.
Now, this has come up just in some conversations that we've had with Robinson professors. And George Johnson actually mentions this in his oral history, that there was some sort of resentment that might have been an undercurrent of resentment from the department-based professors about the Robinson program. Were you aware of any of that?
Oh, my goodness, yes. The leader, I would say, of this would be Jack Sensor, who was the chair of history at that time. He wanted Shaul Bachash and Roger Wilkins in his offices to be with his other people in the department. Makes perfect sense. He was very fond of them, but he did not, and of course Jack is not a person to sit back and keep his opinions to himself. No, he was very unhappy that they were housed separately. And fortunately, Shaul particularly involved himself in the department and went to PT meetings and went to department meetings, and not Roger so much.
Do you have a follow-up?
Okay, thanks.
Could you briefly describe some of the original members of the Robinson Professor Program and tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. And when I walked in September of '87, the suite had just been finished. So there had been 3 of them on campus before that. Thelma Levine, who had come from GW. She was very broadly interested in American history, philosophy, American culture, that kind of thing. So her seminars reached in many directions. Evidently at GW, she had been followed by groups of students all over campus. She had been some sort of a cult figure. And I'm assuming, I don't really know what brought her out here, as she lived in Georgetown, but I assume it was the money, perhaps, as well as, because she was a named chair at GW. So she had been here. Perhaps Shaul Bahash was the first. I'm not sure if he or Paul D'Andrea. Shaul was in history, in Iranian history, and he had taught at Princeton, but he hadn't been a regular faculty member. Paul D'Andrea came from Minnesota, where he had been, I guess, in the theater or English department. I'm not sure, because he was really a wonderful professor of Shakespeare, really extraordinary, but wrote plays also. So I'm not sure exactly what he did at Minnesota. So those 3 had been drifting about campus before the actual room was put together. When it was put together, John Payton came from Northwestern. He was an international. He had been the chair of some kind of a department, international studies at Northwestern. So he was used to operating in administrative roles as well as his own specialty, which was Nigeria. He'd been a dean in Nigeria also, very well thought of in his area. So he, in the whole time of the Robinson program, I would say he was the one who was most involved in administrative things, sat on the library board, was on other boards to hire people in the administration. Wonderful person. Let's see, going around, Jim Treffel then came. He had come from Virginia, from UVA, and he was a fellow Illini from Illinois, so I was glad to see him. When I first saw him, I said, I understand you went to the University of Illinois. Oskiwawo! So that's Jim. And he taught physics, but he was particularly interested in general science education. While he was here, developed his whole ideas of a course like this, and started the book that once Bob Hazen came, the 2 of them put together Science Matters, am I right? I hope.
Sounds right, yeah.
Yeah. And really had an extraordinary program, went all over the United States talking to people about things like that. Moving on around, Hugh Hecklow had come from Harvard, and he was a political science. Very, his strength, he was a wonderful in the lecture hall, but he was a wonderful writer also, so that later, during the time we were there, he received the American Association of Political Science a Lifetime Achievement Award for what he'd written. He didn't write books so much as articles and things. So anyway, he, as I say, had come from Harvard and was active in what was then called Public Affairs Department, I think. Egon Verheyen was art history, German. He was from Germany and had been at Johns Hopkins. Was very interested in German and European history and art history, and was very active in his department. And they were, I think, pleased to have him there. And it was probably all right that he had his own office somewhere else. I'm just guessing. Let's see. I'm not sure the next. Because it wasn't Vasily. Anyway, Bob Marquez was here. He had been at Hampshire and was interested in Latin American literature, and went off somewhere in the Northeast as well. He was here for several years, though. And then Shaul Bakhash, who was, as I say, in Iranian history and had a background in as an editor of a newspaper. So those, and Paul D'Andrea was here, and there was some, he had some kind of an office in English, and then came, and so he eventually had 2 small offices, and then moved down to another office that Bob Hawks had had. We were on the 2nd floor of the East Building, which was up against the suite that Continuing Ed had when Bob Hawks was the dean there. So I think that's about everyone who was originally here.